Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone. Excited for a new weekly edition to the Establish the Edge podcast series. Going to be going over our NFL GPP game scores, something that was developed by Adam Roush, who joins me, and he brought this over to ETR. We've been working on it together. If you have not listened to our intro podcast on GPP game scores, we did one prior to the start of the season. You can find that in the podcast feed. Definitely recommend listening to that. Before we dive into this week's, want to note that this podcast is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. They've got their Battle Royale weekly DFS snake drafts going on. They also have the Resurrection Rest of Season Best Ball contest, and we've got rankings for both of those formats over on Establish the Run. So make sure you check out Underdog Fantasy. If you're new and use promo code ETR, you'll get up to a $100 deposit match on your initial deposit. So again, use promo code ETR over at Underdog Fantasy. And for anyone who didn't listen to that intro episode on GPP game scores that Adam and I did prior, the way this works essentially is I'm going to pull up the game scores for this week so people can see if you're watching on the YouTube channel. But if you're just listening, this will make sense too. But we have a table each week with these rankings of game scores, and these numbers are basically relative to one another. So this week, the top game score for Atlanta at Tampa Bay is 1.9. The lowest is Detroit at New England. It's minus 2.6. Those numbers in a vacuum don't mean a whole ton. It's just a relative weight to one another. And we're looking at different components to come up with these game scores. How much does the stat cost? What's the value we're projecting for it from a DFS standpoint? How much ceiling does the game have? What's the game total? And what's the ownership? Those are kind of all the factors that we're trying to work together, Adam, to come up with one big final score to help you decide, should I play or not? But you do a write-up, Adam, each week. I'll scroll to the top. This has last week's write-up, but you'll add this week's tomorrow at some point. And this is valuable because you break down basically why the games rank the way they do, so you have a little bit more context.
Yeah, I think it's always good to keep in mind that, the numbers are going to turn out. You're going to see games that kind of score similar to one another, and you're going to think that's kind of weird because some games might have a really low total or a relatively low ceiling projection compared to games that might have a higher ceiling projection. So why are they scoring so close to each other? Why are the ownerships? Why is or you can take a look at the ownerships there and see, sometimes a lot of guys are sucking in ownership, bringing that down, or a lot of guys are driving up the average salary. But there's ways to kind of get unique if you kind of dig through the projection. So I always encourage people to read the write-up, look at the table, and also dive into the projections on Establish the Run and kind of dig further so you can start building smarter.
Yeah, and that's important for two reasons, because depending on what your goal is, what your contest in, you might want a low owned stack, or you might not care about the ownership and you just want the highest ceiling stack, or you might want to figure out a way to get different within a stack that's otherwise popular. So that's everything kind of we're going to go over a little bit. Let's look at last week's result. Adam provides me with this chart each week, and I swear at him when the chart looks like it did last week, because it is a chart that shows the average DK scoring from the top 8 players from the game against those players' average ownership. And when the chart goes up linearly, it's bad for us because we see in the top right corner, the highest owned game had the highest average score. That was Detroit, Seattle. Generally, the way I'm playing GPPs, I'm not winning those weeks. I'm not really a play around the chalk type guy. Week 2, it would look much different when we had Miami and Baltimore go nuts. So I'm hoping a little bit different look this week, Adam. But last week was odd. Not only did we have just this absurd single game dominate everything, it was a game people gravitated to because there were so many weather issues in the other games, especially the hot big quarterback games like Lamar, Josh Allen, and Jalen Hurts.
Right. It was a perfect storm. I mean, literally and figuratively, a perfect storm of conditions that we don't like to play in terms of GPPs. Because I kind of like to play like you, where I'm looking for the lower owned game stack that can pop. And again, when you're looking at a chart like this and everything looks pretty linear, and you see Seattle, Detroit way up there, and TJ Hawkinson scores 43 Draftkings points at 22% ownership, and Jamal Williams comes in at 30% and hits, and Josh Reynolds comes in at 17.5% and hits. It's going to be a long week.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Let's look at this week's scores, and a note that these are updated as we update our ownership and fantasy projections throughout the weekend, so they will change. We see the game that comes in best on DraftKings right away, Atlanta at Tampa Bay. And we get Brady in this game. I think he counts in like the upper echelon of quarterback, especially with his salary down now. The one thing that is interesting is like the quarterback slate's a little bit more loaded this week because last week we had less top tier guys and a few of the top tier guys got taken out by weather. This week we get Kyler versus Hurts. We get Brady with his receivers back. We still have Josh Allen on the slate. We still have Herbert on the slate. So some question always as to, do we need one of these top tier quarterbacks? Gary Hartman, who does a lot of our GPP stuff, generally says primarily you want to play these quarterbacks with a really high ceiling. I think Brady counts in here, Adam. This game rates well because it's just sets up. It's so easy to stack and really projects very well.
It is. Chris Godwin is at 5,900 on DraftKings this week. Tom Brady is going up against Atlanta at home. And I think the pieces of the puzzle just really fit. It kind of honestly, it reminds me of Detroit and Seattle last week, where you just have so many value guys that are going to get steamed up. But maybe there's a way you can kind of play the game stack and insert some lower owned pieces. You and I were talking a little bit beforehand. And I think one of the key separators in that Seattle-Detroit game last week was DK Metcalf coming in at single-digit ownership and going off. Is there a guy on the Tampa side or the Atlanta side that could follow a similar path? Mike Evans right now, I think we have for 11% at 6,900 on DK. Russell Gage is projecting for barely any ownership. There could be a route there.
And it looks like Cameron Brate, we have projected in now, but we're making a change there because he's missed the last 2 days with concussion, which, I don't know if Cade Otton's worth playing at the bare minimum at tight end, but it almost might bring in more projection to gauge who people aren't going to play. I like Evans on the high ceiling as Evans is the Metcalf, Godwin is the Lockett, right. Just because people took the $1,000 savings. And you can do that. And like last week, even though we didn't suggest playing it together, it's definitely one where you can play the running back with this stack. This is one, though, if you do stack Tampa Bay Atlanta, you're definitely going to want to get contrarian in your other spots. You're just going to have to, even if you find a guy there. We should also mention Kyle Pitts, who has been a real letdown thus far. Good. Now misses 2 straight practices, which if he doesn't play, we'll see what the Atlanta projection spit out at. But right now, both him and London look like viable bringbacks in this game where Atlanta might actually have to throw the ball for once.
What do you think about QB ownership in game stacks, Mike? I know we talk about this a lot, where does quarterback ownership matter? The nice thing about that Seattle-Detroit game last week is that Goff and Geno Smith came in very low owned, despite all of their weapons being super chalky. Brady is projecting for more ownership than Marcus Mariota. But if we get the right game script where Tampa Bay comes out slinging and they get up big early, even without Kyle Pitts, it kind of puts Atlanta in a spot where they're going to have to try to get back in this game.
Yeah, if I'm playing the Mariota stack and doubling, like assuming they have to throw, I'm probably playing a huge game onslaught where I'm playing 2 Tampa Bay guys still. Right. But it's hard for me to answer this because it's rare that Goff and Geno types put up 35 points. And of course they both did it. So usually what happens is we get, like our ceiling projection was like an 80th percentile outcome on Mariota's 24 points, which usually it could be fine. Depending on the slate, it could win it, but it doesn't move the needle a whole ton. And as a result, I think the ownership at quarterback gets spread out enough that I'm usually not overly concerned by it. But I think Mariota, with his legs and with this game script being one we haven't seen out of them yet this year, is at least in play.
Yeah, it's just and like you said from the top, there's a lot of value here. There's a lot of ceiling. It's one of the highest total game slates on the week, even though Tampa's favored by 10.5. I think I checked right before this. So I think the pieces are there. It's just about how you build the stack. Be mindful of ownership, but there's lots of ways to attack that game.
And do you want to know too that there are no games with a game total above 49 right now, which is a little bit odd. And I never know on slates like this if that makes onslaughting a game better or worse. It kind of, to me, I feel like it makes it a little bit better where if one game just happens to pop off, it could really rule the slate, which is
Right.
sort of what happened last week with the weather dampening things. The one dome game goes off. Unfortunately, it was the chalk game. But we do get a dome game, Philly at Arizona. That's tied for the highest game score on FanDuel. Doesn't rate as well on DraftKings because there's a little bit less catch volume. That's a little bit more efficiency based, and just the way the scoring system works on the site, relative to one another, it rates better on FanDuel. But Adam, one thing I love to do is Galaxy Brain late swap. This is a late game. So for me, I think I like this game a little bit better than Tampa Bay Atlanta now that I think about it, because I could start with this game and then like do some weird things to pivot off. And the ownership doesn't look that bad right now. Like looking at the Philly side, it's the difficulty, I guess, is price with the guys you want, but that's also keeping the ownership down. And Marquis Brown, speaking of price, on the opposite side of Philly, I have him right now as one of the best wide receiver workloads in the NFL. So I do think he's worth playing at 7,200. I don't think people are going to chase that. So I feel like you're insulated a little bit on this stack. It's just, are you going to be able to squeeze it in salary wise?
Yeah, Marquis Brown definitely deserves more love. He is going to be a slight pay up, but I mean, you're right. He's got an elite role, and this game is in a dome. It's projecting pretty well from a play volume standpoint. So I think one other thing to keep in mind with this game, the tight end ownership, I'm curious to see how that plays out, because I feel like Ertz and Goddard are two easy guys you can pick on either site that are going to be targets for volume that fit in well with their offenses. Zach Ertz's role has been really good the last couple of weeks, and Dallas Goedert has the tendency to break off big plays, and they fit well within pricing. So Marquise Brown and Devontae Smith could be interesting pivots off that if you didn't want to play the tight ends with like the expensive, with like AJ Brown or with Jalen Hurts. I don't know what you think about that, but that would be something I would want to keep an eye on with this game.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. I also think like one thing that's a little bit gross, but I've got on the Leone running back underperformer list, like James Conner has been so inefficient, but he does have a pretty good workload. He's been running bad. I think he's interesting. I want to bring up this visual that Michael Heary did for us based on Pat Thorman identifying like pace up and pace down games, and Philly, Arizona, definitely a pace up game. The combined offensive snaps this year for those teams have been really high. I might not have stripped overtime out of that enough, and the average play clock remaining when they snap the ball in neutral situations is basically what anyone in the top right quadrant is, a lot of plays, and they snap the ball somewhat quickly. So Philly, Arizona cracks this. But yeah, and I'm into doubling Hurts. I think their password of expectation has been good enough. So I could see some ways where this game really pops off. I like that it's late. And I think the running backs aren't going to get played in this game on either side, even Miles Sanders on the other side, where I'm hopeful that Boston Scott would be out, though, if I'm going to use Miles Sanders.
Yeah, Miles Sanders will be interesting. I think one other quick note on this before we move on to another game. I was kind of surprised to see that the spread was only 5. That Philly was only favored by 5 in this game. I guess maybe that's because they're playing on the road. But I mean, Arizona has not looked very good on offense recently, and they're going up against one of the best defenses in the NFL, in my opinion. So that'll be interesting to see. We kind of have to hope for the right game script here, I think. Certainly more comfortable leaning into the heavier Philly stack with like an Arizona bring back, but the spread is only 5. We'll see how it goes. And the total is definitely there for us.
Yeah, this Arizona is tough because there's a fine line with them between they get in the negative script that like could juice up the game, or they could just fall apart and it's terrible, which is what we saw week 1 against Kansas City. Whereas some of the other games, they were able to make the comeback against the Raiders, and it juiced up the game a little bit. That game gets going to overtime. So I think those are like the 2 most important games. We're going to look at the other games, maybe go a little bit quicker, but Miami, New York Jets pops on DraftKings quite a bit. Pops on FanDuel as well, tied for the lead. And we might get an ownership discount if people are scared off by Teddy starting over Tua, but I'm still pretty optimistic that Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle have big ceilings here. And then on the Jets side of things, Adam, It's tough because I'm worried people are going to play Breece Hall too much, and that would push me to wanting to play Garrett Wilson and Elijah Moore, and I'm somewhat concerned about Zach Wilson there. So I feel like I don't like this game maybe quite as much as our game scores do right now.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill are always going to pop and ceiling. In the way that Miami's offense, they are. Miami's offense is designed to get those guys open in short space and make them run after the catch and make big plays. That Teddy Bridgewater doesn't have to make impossible throws for them to go off. Just get those guys in space and let them go. Zach Wilson, though, does concern me, his ability to get the ball to Garrett Wilson or Elijah Moore. If people do play Breece Hall at that ownership or maybe even above it, do you think that gets people off the Jets receivers, though? Or do you think people will try to incorporate Breece into stacks?
So I think if you're playing in small field, that the Jets receivers will get squeezed and not played very much, which would be, so I guess that's the main benefit of the game would be like you get the ceiling on the Miami double. And then you get but it's probably better for a mini correlation because I don't know if the quarterback upside's there. If I'm in really small field stuff, like sometimes I'm okay, like doubling the receivers without the quarterback, honestly, and sort of like fitting in 2 game stacks into one in my lineup. I don't know if I'll do that with Miami, but yeah, you get the ceiling on the Miami side, and then the Jets side, you're going to get, if you're willing to get off Breece Hall, you're going to get low ownership on either Garrett Wilson or Elijah Moore. And I think my preference right now is for Garrett Wilson, just based on usage. And I think they'll both be low owned enough in small field that right now we have Garrett Wilson at 7% ownership, Elijah Moore at 2. These are very raw early in the week. And I could see that in large field, but small field, I think they'll both be inconsequentially low, that I just side with Wilson as the higher projected player.
Yeah.
The Pittsburgh Buffalo game. This is a game that rates better on DraftKings than FanDuel. We see this with Pittsburgh games all the time because they're kind of like inefficient, but there's guys like Deontay Johnson and Najee Harris that earn enough volume that, you know, they can get there on catches and maybe the bonuses a little bit better. So that rates better on DraftKings than FanDuel. Right now, the forecast is kind of windy there. So we're going to keep an eye on that, Adam. Yeah. It is an interesting way to play Josh Allen if you wanted to. The Bills, we got to keep an eye on the injuries. Dawson Knox, Isaiah McKenzie on the injury report. So it's hard to know if you want to do a mini correlation where you just play like the Diggs Alpha game and bring back one guy on Pittsburgh, or do you try to play something with Allen and maybe get cute with like, do we finally get the Gabe Davis bounce back game, you know?
Yeah, and God, Gabe Davis's ankle injury is just killing me this year. I mean, we've mentioned this on other pods, but man, we really need Gabe Davis to get to 100% because I think that's really the key that unlocks the Buffalo game stack. And the problem with Allen and Diggs, I play more in DraftKings, so I'm kind of more familiar with that pricing, but it's just so expensive by the time you get those guys, and then you plug in a Deontay Johnson on the other side. It's still doable. I mean, George Pickens, I was surprised that George Pickens was priced as he was. I mean, his role is getting better and better every week, but the win does concern me a little bit, especially since Pickens is kind of more of a downfield receiver from a profile perspective. So yeah, this is, to me, this kind of mirrors, maybe not mirrors, but it's similar to the Miami game in a sense that maybe we would be better off mini correlating and then filling in around that as opposed to trying to just force in a full game stack.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, I think Pickens, you know, you're concerned about his downfield stuff. I think that makes a lot of sense. I also could see the ownership coming in at higher than what like our pure algorithm is spitting out, because there's a lot of narrative around Pickens and Pickett, especially after his success last week, that could get steamed. I'm kind of interested in Pat Freiermuth, who's top 5 in the NFL in tight end air yards. But there is a part of me that wants to try and be ahead of the Pittsburgh receivers in case Pickett is just way better than Trubisky was. Trubisky was so bad. So I mean, I could be talked into any one of the Pittsburgh guys. I would go pass catcher. I wouldn't play Najee Harris, even though the ownership's going to be absurdly low. And again, I would do this on DraftKings, not FanDuel, because the thesis behind someone like a Deontay is going to be enough. You know, the catch volume is going to be there. It's not going to be, Pickens would be the big play efficiency guy. But if you're playing Claypool or Deontay, like that's not it. Fryermuth's kind of in between.
Yeah, we really need Chase Claypool to start getting some more carries again. Remember when he was getting carries those first couple weeks? That was nice.
So one game that intrigues me, it's top 5, comes in 5th on both sides, is Houston at Jacksonville. One of the things I'll be wrestling with before doing Establish a Million with Dink on Saturday is, does Trevor Lawrence have enough juice to get there in GPP? But this is a game that, there's not going to be weather concerns. The total in this game is low, but because of the slate, it's not like drastically lower than the other games. And I think we could see both teams throw a little bit more than they have recently. Jacksonville had the bad weather game against Philly. Houston they finally threw last week, but prior to that in weeks 1 through 3, they surprisingly had decent game scripts that I don't think will last. So I'm mildly interested by this, and it's so cheap. So
it's cheap. Yeah. And with these two teams, where the volume's going from a receiver standpoint. Christian Kirk and Brandon Cooks, those are the guys you kind of need to key in on. Brandon Cooks, we talked about this a little bit in the leading up to this pod, but his catch rate spiked last week. He caught a lot more balls that came his way in a game against the Chargers. The Texans made an effort to get him involved in the passing game, both downfield and on the screen, like behind the line of scrimmage on screens. So, where the volume's going there. I think we just have to be hopeful that the game script is going to play out the way we want it to. Jacksonville's favored by a touchdown right now. So we don't want to fall into a trap where James Robinson just gets the lion's share of the carries and runs away with the game. But it is intriguing. The total is lower. But I agree with you. I think this is a spot where we could see the total hit the over here. And in that case, you're kind of hoping that Brandon and Kirk, or Cooks and Kirk, kind of have ceiling outcomes, and Trevor Lawrence can support a ceiling game, which I think he can do. I think he can do in this matchup.
Yeah, and similar to like Philly, Arizona, where it's a spread of 5. It's like you need Arizona to do just enough to push that game. We're going to need Houston to do enough to push this game. So you absolutely would need to bring it back if you were doing a Jacksonville double. Cook's the most obvious choice, and he might not be that chalky. He's been a little bit chalky, even though he hasn't played well, just because he's projected well and his salary's been in a good spot. We got him low teens right now, which is more tolerable. A lot of tight end issues for Houston as well, where sometimes I just correlate with the absolute pure punt guy. And OJ Howard ran a ton of routes last week. They released Farrell Brown, and I'm not sure if Brevin Jordan will be back quite yet. So,
and they're also mixing in Jordan Akins. They re-signed him a couple weeks ago, and he's been mixing in. So that's another thing to keep in mind with the Texans. I'm kind of curious about Dameon Pierce, how he kind of fits into this, if he does at all. He hasn't been in the league long enough to show consistent big play potential, but we kind of saw it last week. He broke off a 75-yard touchdown run against the Chargers, and he was in on passing downs despite not getting in the box score on the receiving end. But his role is increasing. Do you think there's any room for creativity there with Pierce in a stack?
Yeah, I do. I used him as a bring back on my Chargers double last week. And, like you said, we don't know yet, like if that big playability, it was just a flash, or if it'll be there consistently, but it's nice to have seen it. And those guys can totally flip the script. And sometimes people are afraid to play the underdog running back on a bring back on a double stack, but it's still positively correlated because you get a play like that. And that really helped buoy the Chargers to go from like good to like really good last week, even though it didn't quite get there because of the Seattle Detroit game scoring so many points. So I think he's in play on both sides. He's also priced at a point where I think people are going to start to get a little queasy about clicking him, but it's not too high that he projects really badly from a value standpoint. He's actually our top value on the Houston side on both DraftKings and FanDuel. I do like it a little bit better on FanDuel though.
Great.
The final game to talk about, Chargers Cleveland. And again, going back to the pace scatter plot, this is one of Thorman's pace up games. We're going to have to watch the wind in this one. It looks a little windy, but the total in this game is surprisingly like Actually, it's not that low. It's 47. I thought it was lower. It's 47.5, which is actually what the second highest total on the slate. So
and the spread is close too. It's only Chargers only favored by 2.
So this game really intrigues me. Like if I was going to be aggressive in MME and I wanted something I knew would be low owned, I mean, it's early. Sometimes we do stuff like this and it changes the market, but I just don't see people playing this. The salaries aren't in a great spot. No one individually projects well, but it's pretty easy to make the Herbert double and pick your bring back on the Cleveland side of things and feel really good about ownership, Adam. So this game, as we talk through things, is growing on me, and we get to use the quarterback like Herbert. Some of the other games were like, can we play Lawrence? Can we play Teddy? We know we can play Herbert.
We know we can play Herbert here. You've got a pass catching running back in Austin Eckler who absolutely smashed last week. He's going to be in play. We were talking offline beforehand about the possibility of maybe even putting in Nick Chubb in a stack. It's a little bit off the board, especially on a site like DraftKings, because Chubb doesn't really have the receiving role, but he might. I mean, he's one of the home run hitters in the league this year. I mean, we talk about like Derrick Henry from years past. He could be that kind of a home run hitter, and all it takes is one long run for Chubb to get into the end zone, and all of a sudden you've got a game script where the Chargers need to come back. Herbert's throwing the ball. Chubb is running up his score. And yeah, the total is appetizing compared to the rest of the slate. So, it's intriguing. It's intriguing for sure.
Yeah, it's the Dameon Pierce play, but obviously better because it's more expensive, which is worse, but he's got the history of big playability. And I mean, when he breaks off a 60-yard run, not only do you bank those points, but you've just added so many offensive plays to the other team. And that's when we really see stacks go off. So Chubb's salary, because he's produced so well, has gotten so high that I don't think he's going to be played much on either site. The stack starts to get pretty expensive, but that's a great call by you. I like that. If you want to keep the stack a little bit cheaper, playing like the flop lag on Amari Cooper, I was in on him last week. He got steamed. He was absolutely horrible. Projects for like no ownership this week. Yeah. And I think we're going to see volatility from him because how much Cleveland passes week to week is unknown. And also we could see games where he's a 40% target share or games like last week, So if he gets, I think he just has a little bit more input volatility than some other guys. So I am pretty interested on him as a bring back. I guess we should talk about whether or not to include Eckler in stuff. I think he's low enough that you can include Eckler. He catches touchdown passes. My inclination right now, though, is like Herbert, wide receiver, and Gerald Everett on DraftKings. Yeah. On FanDuel, where the salary is a little bit looser and Everett doesn't project as good of a value, that's where I could see like a Herbert, Palmer, Eckler type of thing.
Yeah, I think the nice thing about this game is you can play it so many different ways because the ownership is going to be held in check for the most part. So whether you want to, play on FanDuel and you want to try to incorporate a running back, or if you go on DraftKings and you play the pass catchers with, Amari Cooper, who is coming off a horrible outing, he's going to have recency bias go in the other direction where no one's going to want to play him. There's so many different ways you could do it. Gerald Everett has a good passing role. Mike Williams, of course. So you'll have lots of options in this game in a decent total. And if it hits, you'll be armed with a lot of good information heading into the afternoon slate. Cause this is on the early slate, right? So you will have that advantage. If you get the low owned stack here that hits, all of a sudden you can start thinking about your afternoon slate and whatever roster positions you have left.
Yeah, that's a very good point. All right. We hope you enjoyed this. We're going to start doing this weekly, taking a look, again, recapping the previous week, and then a look ahead at what we should be stacking in GPPs. You can find Adam's GPP game scores right up on top of the table. We'll have that updated tomorrow evening's generally a good time to check sometime after 6 p.m. EST. Adam usually has to write up in by then, and we usually have a pretty good run of fantasy point and ownership projections as we take in the Friday news. And I will be on Established a Million Saturday morning with Dink to go over what we're thinking from a game stack perspective and all things GPP there. All right. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. Make sure you rate, review us on the Establish the Run YouTube channel, subscribe, and also the Establish the Edge podcast on iTunes.